Welcome, Dr. Epic here, and today we're going to discuss America in World War II, specifically the fighting in Soviet Russia as well as the battles across the North Atlantic. And along the way we're going to discuss White Coke, a giant lady with a sword, the glories of spam, the wolf packs on the open ocean, and the Liberty ships they hunted, as well as how the first computers saved them all. We're going to follow that outline right up above my head, so put that in your notes to serve as a framework for the information that's about to follow, as we continue to build an answer to that question on the lower left. Evaluate FDR's Germany First policy. What was its goal? What did it cost? What did it lead to? Were Marshall and King right, or even a little bit half right? In light of how the Second World War developed, was Germany First a wise decision, especially given the alternatives? How did it shape the post-war world? Now, in the months after Pearl Harbor, in January of 1942, at the Arcadia Conference, Winston Churchill and FDR had decided on a Germany First policy, where Nazi Germany would be defeated first, and then after victory in Europe had been achieved, then the Allied nations would turn to Imperial Japan in the Pacific. So, the bulk of the American wartime effort would then be directed at Germany, with a holding action in the Pacific designed to keep Japan in place while attempting to deny them the southern resource area, that all-important source of oil and wood and iron and rice to keep the Japanese Empire fighting for years. So what we're going to do here is kind of evaluate how this Germany First plan unfolded from 1942 up to 1944. Now, essentially, the Germany First plan had 4 points to it. 1, save Russia and prevent it from collapsing in the face of the German attack. 2, to fight and win the Battle of the Atlantic, driving the U-boats from the ocean. 3, to invade North Africa and then the soft underbelly of Europe. And 4, to hold the Japanese where they were and deny them that all-important southern resource area. So what we're going to do is take each of these plans in turn and see how well they succeeded, or how they failed, or how most of them kind of ended up somewhere in the middle. First, save Russia and prevent it from collapsing in the face of the German attack. Now, Nazi Germany launches Operation Barbarossa at the end of 1941 and smashes Soviet army after Soviet army, nearing the capital of Moscow itself. But by February of 1942, the Soviets had done the impossible. They had halted the Germans just outside of their own capital, just outside of Moscow. And this was largely due to 2 factors. One is the total sacrifice and gallantry of the Russian army, which was determined to halt the Germans regardless of losses. Hundreds and thousands and almost millions of soldiers were thrown in the front of the Germans just to slow down that German war machine. They threw thousands and thousands of soldiers just straight at the Germans, and the Germans had badly underestimated the Russian army. 2, the Russians got a little lucky. The winter of 1941 and 1942 was the coldest winter and the heaviest winter in a century. Temperatures dropped to negative 30 degrees Celsius. German soldiers had not expected, to fight in the winter. They expected a really quick victory over the Russians. Hence, they had not been given winter coats. They hadn't been given winter boots. Their vehicles were not winterized. And when that cold winter came, it paralyzed the German army. The oil actually froze inside the engines. Rifles refused to fire because it was so incredibly cold. The Soviets were even able to launch a series of winter offensives, earning them a bit of a respite and pushing the Germans back from the gates of Moscow. The Red Army proved enormously resilient, fighting much, much harder than the Germans thought possible. Particularly impressive were the Soviet weapons. This included artillery, small arms, and the very famous T-34 tank. And that's it in the upper left. And the T-34 tank is probably the best tank in the world at this point in the war. And all of this, the small arms, the artillery, the T-34 tank, All of this had been part of Stalin's brutal modernization in the 1930s. But it was the discipline of the Red Army, the Russian army, that never broke. Even after multiple Russian armies were just shattered, one after another, by the initial German onslaught. The Russians fell back, regrouped, built new armies, the Germans smashed those, and the Russians just continually threw up new armies in front of the Germans. They never broke. But Russia's position was quite tenuous. By the spring of 1942, the Germans would launch their new attacks on the capital at Moscow. Soviet Russia needed help really, really badly. The winter had just given them a respite of a few months. Now, FDR and Churchill actually wanted to put both the British and the American armies inside Soviet Russia itself, fighting alongside the Soviets, the same way that the British and the Americans had fought alongside the French in World War I. But Stalin, that guy in the middle, Stalin refused, quite rightly thinking that the presence of Western armies would actually undermine the legitimacy of the communist government. Areas that were liberated by the French, or areas that were liberated by the Americans or the British, would likely refuse integration back into the communist state. And the Allies themselves, the soldiers, the Americans and the British, would probably grow, really quite disgusted by the cruelty of the Soviet terror state. Stalin knew that if American and British armies landed in Russia itself, it would ultimately collapse Soviet Russia itself. So Stalin refused. No Allied armies in Russia. Instead, Stalin asked for things that Soviet Russia couldn't make. He said, "Give me all the help I need. I need equipment." And FDR agreed. And these things, what Stalin really needed were American radios, American trucks, American planes, and most importantly, American money. President Roosevelt agreed and began to ship massive amounts of equipment to Soviet Russia. I mean, you can see that list right up above my head. Incredible amounts of trucks and jeeps and rolling stock and oil, most importantly, money. Soviet Russia began to receive massive amounts of American aid. American money at one point in time accounted for almost a quarter of Soviet Russia's war budget. American help accounted for 60% of Russia's aviation fuel. 40% of all Soviet trucks were American made. 20% of all Russian aircraft were American made. At one point in time, 90% of all the rolling stock in the Soviet Union was American made. The Americans were determined to prop up the Russians. Indeed, the most successful Russian fighter of the war, an American plane, the P-39 Air Cobra. The most successful Russian attack plane of the war, an American plane, the A-20 Havoc. Both of these are American-made fighting planes flown by the Russians. Of the top Soviet aces in World War II, 6 of them flew Air Cobras, American-made planes. Of the A-20 Havocs, the Russians loved this plane so much, they said, "Send us all you have." And in fact, 3,400 of these planes would be delivered to the Russians, which made Soviet Russia used more of that American plane than the Americans did. More than 500,000 American jeeps and trucks flooded into Soviet Russia. At one point in time, 1/3 of all American vehicles were American. The American jeeps and trucks were demonstrably superior to their Russian equivalents, and different parts of the Russian army would fight to get these American jeeps and American trucks. But Stalin attempted to hide how dependent the Soviet Union became on American equipment. So Stalin insisted that all American symbols had to be removed from the planes and the bombers and the jeeps and the trucks. They couldn't say America on them at all. They had to take off the Ford emblem. They had to take off the General Motors emblem. They couldn't say made in Detroit. Stalin made a concerted effort to hide how dependent Soviet Russia had become on American help. And they even disguised Coca-Cola. All right, there you see on the lower right, that's what Coke normally looks like, that curvy bottle, and it's a nice caramel color with a nice red emblem on it. But no, The Russians really liked Coca-Cola, but they couldn't be seen to be actually drinking Coca-Cola. After all, it was a product of the decadent capitalist West. So, we made a special communist Coke. We called it White Coke. And that's White Coke right up above me. Coke, it was clear, it was in regular bottles with a big, nice communist star stamped on the top. And indeed, in the Soviet high command, they really drank a lot of Coke. It had a lot of sugar, it had a lot of caffeine, and you didn't have to brew up tea in a samovar. You could just open it up. And especially if you got it halfway through, halfway down, you could just fill the rest of the bottle with vodka and have a good time. So America even disguised the Coca-Cola we sent to Soviet Russia. Now, Stalin's attempt to hide how dependent Soviet Russia was on American equipment was kind of successful. Russian history books, especially ones written after the war, strongly downplay or even omit the American contribution to the Russian effort. And even today, it's not uncommon to read on websites or in books that, it wasn't really the Americans who fought and won World War II. It was really the Russians who beat the Nazis. And they could have done it with or without American help. But the Russians themselves disagree. We have the receipts. We know how many planes and trucks and trains went to the Russians. We've got photographs of Russian high command officers driving around in American Jeeps drinking White Coke. And the Russians themselves talked about how dependent they were on American help. But don't trust me. Trust Nikita Khrushchev. That's him up the left. Nikita Khrushchev was a very high communist official. In fact, he becomes the premier of the Soviet Union after Stalin's death. And this is what Nikita Khrushchev says about the American contribution to the Soviet war effort. If the U.S. had not helped us, we would not have won the war. No one talks about this officially, and Stalin never, I think, left any traces of his opinion, but I can say that he expressed this view several times in conversation with me. So according to Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin himself said, without American help, we would not have won the war. And they're getting ready for this expected German offensive when the weather clears. And that expected German offensive came late in the year. It came in July of 1942. But it also came in an unexpected sector. The Nazis didn't attack Moscow. No, they didn't even attack the fortress city of Leningrad in the north. They attacked in the south. The Blitzkrieg exploded across southern Russia, racing for the Russian oil fields south of the city of Stalingrad. Now, the loss of this Russian oil would absolutely cripple Soviet Russia. Stalin decreed that the city named after him, Stalingrad, must be held at all costs. There it is. And the Battle of Stalingrad would be one of the most important military conflicts in world history. The Battle of Stalingrad was horrific. It lasted from August of 1942 to February of 1943. And the Battle of Stalingrad itself, I mean, you can't get closer to hell on earth than the Battle of Stalingrad. It was this horrific struggle inside this burned out, ruined city between these two armies with like millions of soldiers on each side. The Battle of Stalingrad is one of the most decisive battles in world history, and it is the place where the Russians finally stopped the Nazis. Now, the Russians did this, but they paid a staggering cost. They lost more than 7,000 soldiers every day for 6 months. It was a horrific battle. But examining how the Russians won the battle is quite interesting. It's worth examining. Now, this is how they stopped the battle. So the Germans attacked from the east and reached Stalingrad. And then the Russians stopped the Germans at the city. But then, using the mobility granted by American trucks, they counterattacked. But they didn't attack the city. They attacked the sides of the German army. And the sides collapsed, thus allowing the Russians to trap the entire German army, the German 6th Army, inside that ruined city. And then, once the Germans were trapped in that city, the Russians just bombed it and strafed it and launched artillery and basically proceeded to absolutely massacre the Germans that were inside this trapped, ruined city. But the mobility to do this was provided by American equipment. The planes that went in to fight over Stalingrad, American. There's an air cobra right up above me. There's a Havoc up there on the left. Their ability to move soldiers around to the sides to attack from the flanks in American trucks. There's the photograph. Soviet soldiers being transported in Ford trucks. That it was ultimately the American equipment that gave them the flexibility to trap the Russian 6th Army at Stalingrad. But I don't want to downplay the scale of the Russian victory. It was the Russians themselves that won the battle. They just did it with a lot of American stuff. But it doesn't discount the bravery, the gallantry, and the sacrifice of the Soviet soldiers at the Battle of Stalingrad. And in fact, they commemorated this great victory at Stalingrad with this absolutely monumental statue, a giant lady holding a massive sword. Now, they completed this monument in 1967, and it's called The Motherland Calls, the point at which the Russians finally stopped the nightmare of the German attack. And I don't want to discount the scale of the Russian victory. It was a massive victory, and it was a victory they paid for very, very dearly. You look at those casualty figures at the bottom left. The Soviets lost 790,000 casualties. That's 750,000 Soviet military casualties and 40,000 dead civilians. The Axis themselves lost 740,000 soldiers at the Battle of Stalingrad. And that battered army, when it finally surrendered, 91,000 soldiers surrendered when that army surrendered. And the vast majority of those men would basically die in Soviet prison camps. Only 6,000 of those surrendered soldiers would ultimately survive to return to Germany. I mean, it's less than 10%. The shattered German armies reel back from their massive defeat at Stalingrad. They retreat throughout the winter of 1942, and they really only stabilize by the summer of 1943. In fact, for most of 1943, the Eastern Front is going to seesaw back and forth as these armies of Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia just smash each other right and left, with millions of people dying in the middle. Nevertheless, it had worked. The Soviet Union, Soviet Russia, had been saved. But it was at the cost of a revitalized Soviet state. Back in early 1942, the entire Soviet terror state was on the verge of collapse. By the time you get to 1943, it is fighting the Germans in a rough, mobile stalemate across the Eastern Front. And as the Red Army pushed west, they often arrested millions and executed tens of thousands of innocent people. Often areas would simply exchange Nazi massacres. The Red Army would come in and then immediately launch a series of Soviet massacres. All across Eastern Europe, a Nazi empire was being replaced with a Soviet empire. And there's, in fact, a really fantastic book that's been written on this subject, Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, and how absolutely the people in Eastern Europe were in this no-win situation. They either supported the Nazis and found themselves at the mercy of all this Nazi racist ideology, or they supported the Soviets and found themselves at the mercy of all of this insane communist ideology. Eastern Europe in World War II couldn't win. But, point one, save Russia and prevent it from collapsing in the face of the German attack? A partial success. Russia was saved, but the cost of saving Russia greatly strengthened the Soviet state, and it greatly strengthened the dictatorship of Joseph Stalin. Now, the Soviet Union would then oppose the United States in a long and bloody Cold War for the next 50 years. Oh, and there's one more thing I want to point out there on the left. That is a Soviet armored column going to go fight the Germans, and those are American tanks. Those are M3 Lee tanks. Yeah, in World War II, the Americans like to name their tanks after Civil War generals. So, now point one, save Russia, partial success. Moving on to point two, to fight and win the Battle of the Atlantic and drive the U-boats from the ocean. Because remember, after the failure of the Battle of Britain, Hitler unleashes the U-boats, that's them right up above my head, unleashes the U-boats to destroy and starve out Britain itself. And in each of those blue dots you see on that map on the left, that is a dead British ship sunk by a German submarine. Despite instituting rationing very early on, Britain runs out of food very quickly. Often caloric intake declined to less than 1,500 calories per day. Food became largely dehydrated and concentrated. Meat and fruit became largely unknown. Sorry, no potatoes. There, your meat ration is now carcass meat, 8 ounces, corned meat, 2 ounces. People begin to starve. Here we go. They are reduced to eating horses. Horse flesh sold here. And look right at that chart right up above me. Think about these numbers for a second. Wartime ration, 1 person per week. 2 ounces of tea, 1 ounce of cheese, 4 ounces of bacon. That's 3 slices of bacon per week. 1 egg a fortnight. That's 2 weeks. You get 1 egg every 2 weeks. And you get 1 onion every 3 weeks. People are starving. And when the American supplies begin to show up, they're showed up like that because they've got to concentrate everything for volume. So the eggs are powdered and dehydrated. The milk is condensed. The American food, when it does show up to feed the starving British, is in really unappetizing quantities and in really unappetizing form. But if you were lucky, if you were really, really lucky in Britain, then you got to see this new wonderful thing that the Americans were sending you. Spam! Spam shows up in Britain and basically is a bizarre meat substitute, and it ends up feeding enormous numbers of the British. And the British are glad to have canned spam. Like whatever the hell spam is. And I don't want to talk about what happens to pets. The dogs and the puppies and the kitties in Britain. Let's just really not talk about what happened to them. But there is something called the Great British Pet Massacre. I don't want to talk about it. Now, the British responded to the submarine threat the same way they did back in World War I, through something called the convoy system. And there's a map of how you arrange ships in the convoy system there on the upper left. Now, merchant ships would be placed in the middle of the formation in a grid, and they would be surrounded by a flanking screen of small ships, frigates, corvettes, minesweepers, and those would be protected by destroyers all around it. And the problem was this required a lot of small ships. It required a lot of these anti-submarine hunting destroyers. And again, convoys could be easily scattered. You get a bad storm and it's going to scatter all of these ships. Ships go off course at night because they're observing radio silence. So it's very, very easy to scatter one of these convoys. That nice formation you see on the upper left, it didn't always look like that. And even then, even if the convoy held together, U-boats could often sort of sneak in through the screen, launch torpedoes, and then dive. 2 or 3 ships would be hit, and the German sub would then maneuver to escape the depth charges that were being launched by the destroyers. And especially daring submarines would then turn and fire torpedoes at the destroyers themselves. As submarines could operate in groups, if you saw one sub, there was probably another submarine right around here. And it often meant something very, very cruel had to happen, which is if a ship was torpedoed, nobody could stop and pick up survivors. The convoy had to keep going as fast as it could because it had to get away from the submarine. So in the middle of this convoy, a merchant ship would be hit and nobody could stop and help them because they had to get away as fast as possible. Now, the United States enters the Battle of the Atlantic in early 1942. Now, the Americans believed that the war would be primarily fought in the waters west of Britain, in an area there. This area is called the Western Approaches. Hence, destroyers and convoys really only needed to be used in the Western Approaches, in the waters around Europe. So absolutely no preparations were made for submarine warfare off of the Atlantic, off of the American coast itself. The Americans were like, the Germans are clearly not going to cross the Atlantic and start sinking ships like right off the American coast. But in 1942, the German submarines cross the Atlantic and directly start sinking ships right off the American coast. The results were absolutely catastrophic. Every little green dot you see on that map is a dead American ship killed by a German U-boat. American shipping was crippled by the tremendous losses in those years, and the Americans had to scramble to copy the British convoy system. And these ships paid the price of American unpreparedness. And as the Battle of the Atlantic settles in, convoys and destroyers and even little jeep carriers, the Battle of the Atlantic quickly becomes a struggle between technology and production. Who has the better technology to hide? Who has the better technology to find those submarines? And who can make more submarines or more ships? And the Germans have the initial advantage in this struggle of technology and production, because the Germans use two things right off the bat. The first invention is a German code machine called the Enigma machine. Now, the Enigma machine would code messages in what was supposed to be an unbreakable code. So the Enigma machine would send messages from the submarine back to Germany. And to the Americans, or to the British, it would be just this weird gobbledygook of numbers, and nobody could really figure it out. But with the submarines talking to Germany and Germany talking to the submarines, it meant that the submarines could operate together. They could operate in packs, in these vicious little attack groups that became known as wolf packs. It wouldn't be one or two submarines working together. It would be 6 or 8 or 15 submarines working together. And with the Enigma machines, the German submarines could work in wolf packs. And the results were absolutely deadly. I mean, look at that chart right up above my little yellow box. The number of ships sunk by U-boats in wolf packs goes up. It just absolutely soars. And the Americans and the British feel absolutely overwhelmed as they're losing ship after ship after ship to the German submarines. So the Battle of Atlantic is a struggle of technology and production, and the Americans and the British are not lying down. The Americans begin to use a new technology, something called sonar, where it's basically pinging sound waves through the water in an attempt to find these hidden German submarines. And that's what a World War II sonar set looks like, right up above my head. So the destroyers began to use increasingly sophisticated sonar and high-powered radar against the U-boats' Enigma machines and Wolfpack tactics. And the struggle is being measured in ships sunk in the Atlantic Ocean. And the question was Allied shipping going to collapse before the technological struggle could be won? How are the Americans going to replace all those ships that the Germans sank in 42 right off the coast of America? The Americans respond with something very interesting. The Americans respond with the Liberty ship, and that's a Liberty ship up on the upper left. Now, what is a Liberty ship? A Liberty ship is a mass-produced cargo ship of roughly 14,000 tons, and they made these things very quickly, very rapidly, and very cheaply. They used thin steel that would be welded instead of riveted in place. Some Liberty ships even just sort of carved sides made out of concrete. The Liberty ships could be built very quickly. Liberty ships could often be built in 24 days. And the production of Liberty ships soon completely outstrips the ships sunk by the U-boats. And you look at that chart on the left, the black columns are ships sunk by the Germans. And you can see the terrible losses in 41, the terrible losses in 1942. But by the time you get to 1943, boom, the Americans are replacing all of their losses. The United States replaced all of the ships that were being sunk by the Germans, and it even replaced all the ships sunk by the Germans back in 1942. The United States would go on to build 2,700 Liberty ships, an enormous level of production. And what makes the Liberty ships even more interesting, almost all built by women. There they are, welding the ships together. There she is getting ready to weld different parts of the Liberty ship together. You can see the diagram on the upper left. It all came in prefabricated sections. It would be delivered to the factory, and the women would weld it together. And this starts the great legend of Rosie the Riveter. There is Rosie the Riveter. That's a very famous Norman Rockwell painting there on the left. And there she is right up above me. Note that her makeup game is on point. And there she is. We can do it. And the Liberty ships were built almost entirely by women because, of course, the men are off fighting the war. And it is one of the great accomplishments of American women that they were able to do this in such a rapid period of time. And one of my favorite things about that Norman Rockwell painting is if you look at Rosie the Riveter, big beefy Rosie the Riveter, she's got her work shoes. She's wiping her she's wiping her shoe on Hitler's book, Mein Kampf. Yeah, take that, Hitler. And of the 2,700 Liberty ships, most of them have long sunk or been scrapped. I think there's like 4 Liberty ships that still exist as museum ships. They're incredibly neat. But again, the struggle continues. This is a struggle of production and technology. And the Americans start to win this struggle. And one of the things they start to do is they start to put high-powered radar in airplanes, aircraft-mounted radar, especially in those planes on the upper left. Those are called Catalina flying boats. And they would have these incredibly powerful radars in the forward part of the plane. And they'd fly across, and this radar would sweep the ocean. And it was so powerful it could actually pick up the occasional German submarine and then sort of angle in to drop bombs on it. But the Germans themselves were not lying down. They responded with an invention of their own, an incredible new type of submarine called the Type 21 Electroboat. And it was the first real submarine because the Electroboat almost never needed to surface. It could cruise underwater almost its entire time, only sort of poking up a periscope to recharge the batteries at night. But the turning point comes in mid to late 1943 with a sort of mild-mannered English mathematician, Alan Turing. And Alan Turing cracks the Enigma code in December of 1943. It was a place called Benchley Park where all of the top British scientists and British mathematicians and British engineers were trying to figure out some way to crack these weird sequences of numbers, and they could listen to the German U-boats talking to Germany. They just didn't know what was being said. But it comes down to a mathematical genius, Alan Turing. And Alan Turing starts to put together how to decipher these codes. And he deciphers one, he deciphers a second. But he says, the problem is that we're not deciphering these things quickly enough. What we need is something that can decipher the codes quickly, like this. Because by the time it takes us to do it manually, the code is 5 or 6 days old and the submarine is long gone. So Alan Turing gets together with engineers and mathematicians who are from exiled Poland, and they build something that they call the bomb. But today we would call that a computer. And Alan Turing and the engineers and mathematicians of Benchley Park invent the world's first computers. And they do this in order to decipher all of those messages being sent back and forth between the U-boats. And they do it in December of 1943. And every time a German U-boat surfaces and talks to Germany, the English know exactly what was being said. And because they can triangulate now on the source, they also know exactly where the German U-boat is. So they can tell Allied planes and Allied destroyers, U-boat here, and the entire German communication system collapses as they very quickly realize the English are listening in. So they change the code, and the computer cracks the new code. The Germans change the code again, and the computer cracks the new code. They can't escape Benchley Park and Alan Turing's computer. So we get to the end of 1943 and the beginning of 1944, the Germans have clearly lost the fight over technology and production in the Battle of the North Atlantic. Convoys are being guarded by fierce defenses of radar and sonar. Dozens of little escort carriers, like you see above my head, could fly airplanes out to patrol for hundreds of miles. And the breaking of the Enigma code meant that the wolf packs couldn't communicate with each other. And if they did, the Allies knew the message and they knew the location. And when U-boats sank merchant, new Liberty ships could replace them. For every ship the Germans sink, 3 or 4 more Liberty ships take its place. And you can see the impact that all of this was having in that chart on the left. That chart on the upper left is the boats sunk by the U-boats. And you can see it spikes with the Enigma machine, and then they crack the Enigma code, and it completely plummets. The Germans have lost the Battle of the North Atlantic. And then, to rub salt into the wound, the Allies began organizing small groups of ships, Small little carriers like you see right up above me with a half a dozen destroyers would be put together into a group of what was called hunter killers. And these hunter killers would sail around the convoys, specifically looking for German submarines. In the North Atlantic, the hunters had become the hunted. U-boats began to die by the dozens, and then U-boats began to die by the hundreds. And you can see that chart on the upper left. That is U-boats sunk in the North Atlantic. By early 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic was effectively over. In the German Navy, by the time you get to 1944, being assigned to the submarine service was virtually a death sentence. Thousands of German sailors went to the bottom of the ocean inside their broken submarines. But not one. There's a special submarine. And that special submarine is submarine U-505. The Germans didn't name their submarines. They gave them numbers. Because what happened with submarine U-505 is it was detected, it was bombed, and it surfaced. And the German crew abandoned ship because they didn't want to go to the bottom of the ocean inside this broken submarine. And then they attempted to open the hatches to allow the submarine to sink. But then dawn comes and an American destroyer shows up, and they look over and there's this abandoned German sub bobbing in the ocean. And the Americans are like, we should totally steal that German submarine. And then they proceeded to totally steal that German submarine. On June 4th, 1944, a bunch of grinning American sailors seize an intact German U-boat. And there it is, it's U-505. And they put a giant American flag on it because they don't want any British or Americans bombing their prize. And they tow it back to America. And that's why, if you go to Chicago, it's still there. If you go to Chicago, you can actually go inside this captured German U-boat from 1944. In fact, I think it's one of the most intact German U-boats in the world, in Chicago. But you see, most U-boats didn't end up like U-505. Most of them ended up like this, U-576. Broken, twisted wrecks at the bottom of the ocean. And there's a lot of these boats scattered all across the Atlantic. These sad little wreckages that were attempting to fight the Battle of the Atlantic. And, I'm not a scuba guy. I'm not a scuba guy. But I've been told that if you're really into scuba, diving on a German U-boat is the coolest thing you can do in terms of scuba diving. And here's your nightmare fuel for the weekend. Inside the ruin of U-576, a group of divers actually got down to this ruined U-boat. They started knocking on the side of the boat, and they realized that the sounds were hollow. So there's parts of this sunken U-boat that are still intact, that still have air inside of them. And inside, so creepy, inside the U-boat, that means there's a bunch of dead Germans still sitting in their seats in front of their busted instrument panels. Because the U-boat hasn't flooded completely. Eerie. 2. So the second goal of the Arcadia Conference, the second goal of the Germany First Plan, fight and win the Battle of the Atlantic, driving the U-boats from the ocean. Complete and total success. The Allies won the Battle of the Atlantic. The U-boats were smashed, and passage from America to Europe was open. Yet, every plane, every pilot, every ship, every sailor that was sent to fight Germans in the Atlantic was one less plane, one less pilot, one less ship, and one less sailor who didn't go to the Pacific to fight the Japanese. And among other people, Admiral King, the head of the U.S. Navy, Admiral King points this out to the president. He's like, look, you are starving the Pacific theater of resources. You are setting up the Pacific for catastrophic failure. And Admiral King would kind of be right about this. But we'll talk about that next time. And I will see you there. Now, I want to talk about something serious for a moment, which is the very sad story of what happens to Alan Turing, the man who more or less won the Battle of the Atlantic, the man who deciphered the Enigma machine, the man who invented one of the first computers, this mathematical genius. And he really was a genius. He was incredible philosopher, mathematician, engineer, one of the people who saved Great Britain itself. But Alan Turing's story gets really, really sad. Alan Turing was homosexual, and homosexuality was a crime in Great Britain. And the British were able to overlook this during the war because, there's a war on. But in the years after the war, the British were not so understanding. And in 1952, Alan Turing was caught in a tryst with another man. And he was convicted of the crime of homosexuality. And they gave him a choice. They said, look, you've got a choice, Alan Turing. You can do one of two things. One, we can just send you to prison, all right? Like a lot of gay men in the 1950s were just straight up sent to prison. Or two, we have this radical new treatment that we could try, this organotherapic treatment that's supposed to flood your body with chemicals, and it's going to like cure you, of homosexuality. And Alan Turing wasn't given that was not much of a choice. He didn't want to go to prison. So reluctantly, he agreed to this like chemical treatment, this theoretical experimental cure for homosexuality. And it involved massive cocktails of drugs that, among other things, ended up chemically castrating him. And Alan Turing, his body just like warped beyond all measure. It became very weird and bloated, and his body started doing things it wasn't supposed to do. And it didn't work either. This chemical cocktail did not work. And Alan Turing just couldn't take this anymore. And in 1952, Alan Turing kills himself. He takes an apple and injects it with poison, and then goes to bed, eats the apple, and then goes to sleep. Alan Turing dies because of this insane chemical cure, supposedly for the crime of homosexuality. And this is how Great Britain treated one of the great war heroes that had saved it back in the dark days of World War II. Now, when they have these pride parades, these gay pride parades in Britain, one of the things that tends to happen is that the parade tends to make a slight detour, and then everyone gets very quiet because they go to the monument of Alan Turing and they cover it with flowers. They attempt to just bury the monument of Alan Turing in flowers as a nation, an entire nation is attempting to apologize for what they did back in 1952 at the Alan Turing Monument. And there is the Alan Turing Monument. And listen to what it says. Alan Turing, father of computer science, mathematician, logician, wartime codebreaker, victim of prejudice.